Right. So in recent days and or weeks, depending on when you listen to this, a little humble game called Stranger of Paradise was released, and it was the latest in the Final Fantasy series as such. It's not a numbered Final Fantasy. It's not Final Fantasy 16, but it is a reimagining of the original Final Fantasy. So it was done by Square Enix and Koei Tecmo's Team Ninja. So the same team that did Neo basically took their expertise of Neo and threw it into a Final Fantasy Souls-like action RPG, which was not what anyone expected, because when they actually sat down to play it, they realized it was basically taking the piss out of both the Souls series and Final Fantasy. And that threw people, and that is what we're talking about here on this podcast. Basically, to use the technical term for it, we're talking about metatextuality, which sounds very big and impressive and smart, but I swear to you, we're not. It's just
we are not smart. Yes, absolutely.
That is just what it is called. It is basically the idea that you take a existing text, and by text I do mean, theater, music, film, whatever, and then make a new text that is in some way an observation or a deconstruction of that original. And it is actually really exciting that this has happened with video games in the last couple of years. There has been a couple of other ones, and we'll talk about that shortly enough, but it is interesting that it has happened because it does suggest a certain level of maturity of video games as an art form, that we have this body of content, this body of works that artists are now starting to explore and deconstruct as a way of kind of not only providing a homage to the original work, but also investigating the nature of games and the themes of these games. And it's just very interesting. And I kind of make this mention in my review, but for me, it feels very similar to some of the great works of theatre that I really love. For example, there's Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, which takes the original work of Hamlet from Shakespeare and then creates an entire kind of conversation about both Hamlet and its key themes by being this satirical kind of takedown of Hamlet. And that is very much what I got out of Stranger of Paradise. So I love that this is happening. It's not the first time it's even happened with the Final Fantasy series. I would say that Final Fantasy VII Remake does a very similar thing, in that it takes the original Final Fantasy VII and reworks it in a way that kind of talks about Final Fantasy VII as an artwork. And Stranger of Paradise is the same thing. So that's what we're going to be talking about after that long introduction to this section. I know you've played a little bit of Stranger of Paradise Harvard. Did you get much of a sense of that through the bit that you've played?
Should we talk about Stranger of Paradise first, or should we talk about just this technique in general first?
Well, let's talk about them in parallel, and you can use other examples if you think there are better examples.
Because I have a lot of thoughts about the technique. I think Stranger of Paradise is... So I haven't played enough to get the whole satirical angle of it, but it is just so painted with the stuff from Final Fantasy 1, like even the stuff that's become the memes, like immediately going to face off against Garland, and all the reputation that original narrative has is very funny. I love the premise. They just chucked 3 extremely muscular dudes into the world of Final Fantasy and being like, it's absolutely taking the piss of the whole prophecy and instead just punching your way through the world. So that's been fun. I think original game is kind of iconic enough that if you say certain areas or certain characters, you kind of just pick up on what's happening. So I think they picked a good, I guess not target, but like a good for what they're trying to. I think it comes across very clearly what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it is very obvious what they're doing right from the outset. It's definitely not a game where you need to be interpretive of what it's saying to get the core message of it. It is very, very much a satirical take on Final Fantasy I's themes and a subversion of them in a way that is very clear from the outset. For a good example of that, everybody who's played Final Fantasy I knows that the first town that you go to after the original town. So once you start in your adventure, you go off and start exploring the world. The first little village you come to has become infested by pirates. It has been taken over by this pirate captain, and you go and defeat the pirate captain after talking to like one person in the town. And as a result of that, you get the boat, which is a major kind of development in the game, and so on and so forth. The way that Final Fantasy, or Stranger of Paradise, sorry, the way that Stranger of Paradise does that is it shows you that actually the pirate was kind of good for the town. He was protecting them, and in the absence of other leadership, which is all very absent, he was actually something of a hero to the people. So you do get that direction that the pirate has taken over the town, and that is why certain resources are not available to you at that point in time. But actually, everybody else kind of likes that they're around. So it does do an interesting little subversion of that. It takes the exact story. This is the overall plot still progresses in the same way. So once you defeat this pirate, you get to progress to the next part of the world. It keeps all of that, but at the same time, it reframes it in a way that makes you look at events of the original Final Fantasy in a different way. And you realize, oh, hang on, this automatic assumption that you can just rock up to a town and then go fighting stuff and take their stuff is a little bit of a simplification about how heroism works. And this game just does that over and over again, like every opportunity.
What do you mean the heroes are the bad guys?
It's a bit
or in this
case,
or in this case, the heroes are the guys that play their podcast or their iPod rather than listen to a serious conversation and then just kind of walk out the room. That's this game has a lot of those kind of little visual puns, which are good fun. It also is very kind of communicative about the Final Fantasy series as a whole. There's a great level which is very linear. It's set in a forest, and it feels like this forest should be this kind of wide open space to explore. It looks like it should be, like you can see horizons and things that suggest that it's big and open, but you're actually on a very narrow path, a very, very narrow path in this one. And you'll be thinking, well, this is a bit of a wasted opportunity. Why is this level so linear? And then you'll realize, oh, hang on, it's playing the Final Fantasy 13 music in the background. So it's kind of and it's a joke. It makes a joke of the level design about Final Fantasy 13 and the fact that people were hypercritical of it being so linear and all that kind of stuff. So this game is just full of those little jokes, in-jokes, deconstruction, subversions, and it's just fascinating that they've done this. What I was always interested about with this whole thing, with metatextuality as a general thing, is whether the audience is kind of along for the ride, because generally with video games, what we expect is that the video game is going to be this high quality thing. And in the Souls-like series, I guess we can point to Elden Ring now. People kind of expect that it's going to be this thing that takes gameplay fundamentally seriously, that it's not making a joke of the gameplay. But Stranger of Paradise kind of does make a joke of the gameplay, and I was wondering how audiences would get along with that. I've been quite impressed, actually. It seems like people do get the humor, that the fact that this game doesn't play as well as Elden Ring is kind of the point. But it was interesting to me whether that would work, because
I think that's a smart thing to have done, knowing that you're releasing a game around the same time as the developer known for making this style of game. It's interesting that they took this approach.
Well, I was kind of wondering at the start, because the early previews and all that stuff we got of it's kind of suggested that it was actually going to be a more serious interpretation of the Souls-like formula, that it was going to try and do what From Software does with Souls and Elden Ring and whatever. But perhaps it was just those early previews were designed to get people in a way, or perhaps it was that they did change tack to kind of change direction after those initial impressions to make it a little bit more self-aware. But either way, what we have got here is a game that is good. It plays really nicely, but at the same time, it doesn't play like Elden Ring nicely, if that makes sense. It's kind of, it's really hard to explain, because once again, we kind of expect that video games are made to a certain set of qualities, and this one is high quality, well made, and very enjoyable, but it's not good in the way that we generally expect good to be.
Do you think
Yeah,
it's
I'm
more
trying to think of it.
niche? Like in the sense that only Final Fantasy fans would get this sort of thing? Like, do you think that like if someone else which never had played Final Fantasy before or Dark Souls style games picked up this game, but they would be like, what is going on? Why am I on this ride? This is weird. I don't get it, sort of thing. Like, do you think that it would be more niche because of that? Or do you think that it would have more overall appeal to other gamers or general public?
Well, I mean, that's kind of the thing with metatextuality. It kind of assumes that you've played the original text, right? Otherwise, it's a little bit hard to quite get it. And to go back to my example of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead, can you enjoy that play if you haven't already seen Hamlet or familiar with Hamlet? Yeah, I guess there is humor in there that is kind of universal and not related to the original text. But at the same time, the fundamental quality of the thing is that original. And we saw that with Final Fantasy VII Remake. If you hadn't played the original Final Fantasy VII, which is not that many people, and Square Enix was probably assuming that, but if you haven't played the original, then would you quite get what that game is saying? I would suggest probably not. And I would certainly say that's the case with Stranger in Paradise as well. If you don't know what the 4 kind of warriors of light are, if you don't know what the crystals are, if you don't know what the Souls-like formula is, if you don't know that the conversation about difficulty modes and all that kind of stuff, if you're not aware of all of this stuff, then a lot of what Stranger Paradise offers will fly over your head. But see, for me, that's okay. Again, as the maturity of video games, as a sign of the maturity of video games, there needs to be that understanding that not every game needs to be for every person or designed with to have kind of that kind of absolute mass market appeal where every person that picks it up can enjoy it. The point of this one is that it is there for people who have enjoyed the original Final Fantasy and do enjoy the Souls-like games and want something that deconstructs those, and that's okay. At least as far as the art style, at least as far as the artistry goes, that's okay.
Yeah, I think it's just, if you haven't played the original Final Fantasies and you play this one, it's just kind of a big dumb action game, you know, like you can still have fun pressing buttons. It's still made pretty well. It doesn't really matter if a joke flies over your head. I think and maybe Matt, you can correct me on this if I'm wrong because I haven't played the whole thing, but the narrative itself doesn't feel completely beholden to the original games in that you won't understand it if you haven't played the earlier ones. It's a story that still makes sense, but it builds upon elements from the previous ones. So certain things have more significance, or certain things have like a deeper significance if you're aware of the history. But if you're not, it's still just an action quest kind of story.
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't played the original Final Fantasy, then, for example, when you get up to the pirate, Bicky, I always say his name is Bicky. I don't know if it's actually meant to be Bicky or Bicky or Bikey or however it's meant to pronounce that pirate's name. Once you get up to him in Stranger of Paradise, you'll still recognize that he's this pirate dude, and you meet to defeat him because it's a boss battle, and then you'll get to progress the narrative, and there's cutscenes to explain why he's there. And like you say, it all makes sense if you haven't played the original. But a lot of his appeal as a character in this one, a lot of kind of the underlying message and the reason that he's a pretty cool character in this game does rely on you understanding his role in the original Final Fantasy. So it is just one of those games. I would definitely recommend people play the original Final Fantasy before playing this for those reasons. But if you do happen to pick it up, like Harvard said, then you do still get to enjoy a big dumb action game, which is a lot of fun and it has a lot of stuff going for it just as a pure action game. Even if you put aside the narrative stuff, it has this really neat Diablo style loot system where you will get an awful lot of loot and get to play around with costumes and characters and all that kind of stuff. It just really works as a stupid action game. But yeah, I do think that you're better off if you have played the original.
Yeah, I haven't played the original since like probably 20 years, like 25, I don't know. Like it's a long time ago. And for me, the way the brain works, all I know is Final Fantasy has blue guy, red guy, and whatever. And
that's probably better actually. Like if you have this hazy memory of what the game used to be, that's a good place to be when you're playing Stranger of Paradise, because you'll go to a town and be like, hey, that's kind of familiar. And then it'll make work its magic, right? It'll like play with your memory of it. Whereas I don't know how well it would work if you closely did a comparative study. Like it's not like Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern when you're meant to read them next to each other and write an essay about it.
I kind of disagree on that as somebody who has played Final Fantasy a lot. I actually played Final Fantasy in parallel to Stranger of Paradise
and it
to
works.
It does work as a thing where you're a bit like Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern did. You actually do experience them in parallel and then write an essay about them. That's what I wanted to do after coming away from it. And that's why it is so interesting to me as a work of, it's probably the best work of metatextuality that we have as yet. The most clear kind of parallel to Hamlet and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern that did are Final Fantasy 1 and this one, because what this one does with the original Final Fantasy 1 is just so interesting. The way it subverts it and the way it uses that base narrative in a way to create its own messaging and to have an underlying kind of absurdist narrative too. I mean, the actual kind of philosophical underpinning, if you want to call it that, of this game is actually very similar to Stoppard's own work. So I would actually genuinely be surprised if this author, or the writer behind the narrative of Stranger of Paradise is not familiar with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern the Dead. The parallels are just too clear for me for it not to be quite deliberate.
So then I might pivot to a different point then, and Matt, you'll really enjoy this one, is that if you want to make a game with such close connection to an earlier title, the earlier title needs to be available. You know, there needs to be accessible to the point that even if you didn't grow up with the game, and I definitely didn't grow up with Final Fantasy 1, you can still play it quite easily. And I can even see a possibility where Stranger of Paradise is released with like, with the Final Fantasy 1 pixel remaster double pack or whatever, you know, like it needs to signal to players, hey, this is your required reading if you want to enjoy the game to its fullest.
Well, I mean, I really think they wouldn't have done it because for a start, they actually just re-released Final Fantasy 1 as that pixel remaster. So they were making money from it, but really they should have put the pixel remaster in the game as like a menu option off the main menu or something for that exact reason. Your enjoyment of this game is definitely enhanced by being familiar with the original
click here
work.
to go to the store and buy it.
No, it should be like it should be like a pack, a bit like, you know, well,
it's not going to be a pack.
if you were going to sell a copy of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern the Dead, it really should come with Hamlet. Saying that it doesn't, so I guess that's kind of a moot point. But too much capitalism involved in this industry. But yeah, that's the.
I actually have a more weirder point in terms of how capitalism works and in terms of how gamers play games. What if this game becomes Final Fantasy 1 in the sense that future generations, they go and pick up Final Fantasy 1, this is Final Fantasy 1 for them, if that makes sense. Like this is the remake, this is the version, and then the original Final Fantasy is just lost to memory and the story continues and gets, you know, edited and modified and remade, but it's based off this version of the Final Fantasy 1 experience.
No, it can't happen like that, for the exact reason that it's not a remake, it's not a remaster, it's not a reimagining. This is the thing that I guess I think we talked about this on a podcast in the past, that these terms are a little bit too limiting for what developers can do with this stuff. That everything
I do remember this, because what you're saying, that applies to Resident Evil remake, absolutely, but not to this one because it's just too different.
Well, that's the thing. There's this obsession in the industry and putting everything into these nice little neat categories that it's going to be a reimaging or a remake or remaster or whatever. This is not that. This is an independent, separate project. It's not. It uses the original Final Fantasy, and it does so in a very fundamental way to the game, but it is not an attempt to anything that original Final Fantasy. This is its own separate work, and it's just like, again, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern the Dead versus Hamlet, that the existence of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead did not replace Hamlet by any means, and they exist in perfect parallel to one another, to the point that we inflict them on school kids, to the point that Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead is not funny anymore. By the time you finish reading that and studying that at school, you're not laughing at its jokes anymore. But they just exist in parallel, and that is the best way to describe this. And it really is exciting to me that this is happening. I don't think it's going to happen too often in the immediate future, but that this is now part of the game development toolkit, that there is a pathway to show that this can actually work. And there is an awful lot of classic games out there that would benefit from having this kind of look at them. Is a creative potential that I'm very interested in potentially seeing explored more. Unfortunately, it does seem to be, I do want to say, it does seem to be the only, there does seem to be only one artist that is doing it. I didn't realize this until I was researching my review later on, but the writer of Final Fantasy VII Remake and the writer of Stranger of Paradise are actually the same person. So I reckon that this is just the writer's creative vision. This has nothing to do with Nomura. People pointed to Nomura being the producer of both Remake and Stranger of Paradise, as though that's kind of relevant. I don't think it is. I think it is just entirely due to this writer guy, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head on this podcast, but he seems to be.
You've got to shout him out.
He seems to be the one that's responsible for the creative vision behind both games, and I would suggest that he's probably the only one that is doing this, at least in the near.
I was going to say exactly the same thing, is that Square Enix is uniquely positioned to do this because they have that long-running history of IP and a willingness to be risky with it, and the resources to make something on this scale. They're really the only developer who will push this out. Because if we think of other companies, if you look at like Nintendo, or I don't know why Bethesda was the first thought that came to my head, but they've been doing a lot of similar metatextual stuff in Fallout. They are too risk adverse, then they will not rely on anybody having played on a previous game because they need to sell copies. Whereas I think Square Enix are making an aesthetic vision by integrating elements from existing properties that they own. So I can't see this kind of storytelling coming from anywhere else, because either the developer doesn't have the IP or the original resources to make a reference to the existing text, or it has that much IP and doesn't want to take any risks with it.
Yeah. And I mean, I did make this kind of point in my review at Stranger of Paradise that this is so fundamentally transformative to the original Final Fantasy. It would be like taking a Call of Duty and making a pacifist game as a remake, or taking, what's another classic IP that another publisher owns? If you were to take an Assassin's Creed game, for example, and make an entirely linear pathway-based game that is like Prince of Persia. Like if you're reimagining of Assassin's Creed 3 was actually Prince of Persia, the American Revolution edition, then that would be roughly kind of how transformative these companies would need to be with these properties to bring them in line with what has been done with Stranger of Paradise. And that's just not going to happen. Square Enix is pretty much the only publisher out there willing to allow that level of creative risk with its most important property. So you are right in that regard. It's not something we're going to see with the big ones too often, even beyond the fact that it seems to be just the creative vision of the writer, who I've just checked his name is Kazuhige Nojima. You probably haven't heard of him because everybody just thinks these are Nomura games, but he seems to be the one that is behind this. So even beyond the fact that there seems to be one guy that's doing this, the commercial reality is that companies aren't going to allow this to happen. But looking through,
a big developer or publisher might come out, like Microsoft might be like, oh, let's leverage one of our IPs sort of thing. And like, they might be like influenced by what Square Enix is doing right now. And, you know, it might be one of the big reveals for something, you know, when the next generation comes out or something like that. It's like, here's this game, it's an old IP, everyone loves it, but it's like a weird twisted reimagining on the original. Like if they did, you know, what's that one Ubisoft game which everyone keeps wanting but keeps dying? So like that would probably be what Ubisoft would reboot and do the same sort of thing with, and reimage based off one of the original to bring new fans in, but also entertain people
It's
which were
then
fans of the series.
to give you, I mean, if Microsoft was to do something like that, then it would be something along the lines of a Halo game, which is questioning the kind of the nationalistic xenophobia and hero worship of Master Chief, and all of a sudden, you know, Master Chief is no longer this paragon of stoic heroism and stuff. That would be
So
what we're talking
that
about, and
kind
they just
of exists actually.
does
That's
it.
the Halo novels. It's the Halo novels, and it's also the I think it's called ODST. There's like a really, really niche Halo game that's actually very critical of the underlying narrative, and it is non-linear and it is self-referential, and no one played it.
Right. Well, I'm not that familiar with Halo, I guess, to be into the kind of the niche stuff in
It's
terms
really
of
hard to
the
find
novel.
now.
Yeah, you know, if it exists, then great. But I don't see them doing that with the Halo itself. You know, why would they?
Maybe a Call of Duty. Maybe they just like, maybe once they get Activision, they're just sick of Call of Duty being a propaganda
Because
game.
I
They
mean,
just flip it on the side.
the other thing is you've got to approach these things as a kind of a creative work first, and a piece of content to sell second. And I think that Square Enix knows that its audience are perhaps a little bit more open to this than Microsoft's audience would be or Sony's audience would be. You just look at the respective fan bases, and you can see that the fans for Halo or for The Last of Us or whatever, they're not that open to subversion. they're not that open.
Yeah, they're really not.
They
just want a new game.
Yeah, they're not that open to having their idea of what these characters are challenged, and that perhaps is a little bit for a discussion beyond the scope of this podcast for another one down the track. But just in general, Western entertainment, Western IPs and stuff, that's the management of those properties is more about giving fans more of what they wanted.
Even if it's sort of like a take on something, it's like, it's fun and light.
Here's a really great example of it, that with the second Star Wars film in the recent remake series, I can't remember which one it was subtitled as, the one that Rian Johnson made.
The one that everyone didn't like.
Yeah, that was the one that no one liked because it did these things. It challenged the established kind of expectations of Star Wars. It kind of subverted them. It was less than subtle and less than intelligent about it because Rian Johnson's not exactly the most subtle filmmaker, but it did a lot of what Stranger of Paradise does to Star Wars, and people hated it that much that they brought J.J. Abrams on board for the third and kind of final of that trilogy, and told him quite obviously to give the Star Wars fans exactly what they wanted, and the mental and the logical leaps that he had to make that third Star Wars film be the Star Wars film that the Star Wars fans wanted was resulted in a less than admirable film, and they ended up creating something that was pretty terrible as a result of that.
Isn't also then the complaints that, oh, well, the film is, you know, yes, is what we wanted sort of thing, but it's like not good because it's doing all this stuff. Like, you can't have it both ways.
Well, that was
actually,
the thing.
Star Wars is a great example because the Star Wars games are doing this to the Star Wars movies series. There's lots of video games that take this subversive attitude towards the stories of the films, and they are mildly successful at it, I guess.
I mean, I haven't played enough of the more recent Star Wars games to get a sense of that, I guess. I would say that from the experience that I have had about them, they do kind of locate within the Star Wars series, and they kind of might exist to give you a different perspective on things. But in terms of actually deconstructing Star Wars, I would suggest they don't really do that. This is is another level kind of entirely. But yeah, if there was a Star Wars game that was to challenge the entire idea of Star Wars as a kind of Western set in space epic thing, then that would be interesting to me. I'd certainly love to see it, but I just don't know if there exists the creative thrust to make that happen.
Now that you say it
It'll
that
be
way,
an
I
Eastern
actually
set in
agree. Yeah.
space.
So yeah, I mean, this is another level in time. This is something that is, it's difficult. Like you've probably seen me stumble over my words in this podcast. It's difficult to fully articulate just how much these kind of works that, you know, Stranger of Paradise and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern did, how much these works kind of deconstruct and explore the original work. This is a little bit different to just kind of to just challenging the established norms of the property. So yeah, like I said, I don't see this happening too often with too many other properties out there, but the fact that it exists is, again, a sign of maturity for the video game industry, and I'm impressed. It happened quite quickly, so quickly, really, because it's, the games industry still has only been around for what, 50 years or so as it is, in the form that it is. So that's actually pretty fast development for the industry. It took film a lot longer than that to get to this point. It took literature a lot longer than that. So yeah, the games industry is maturing as an art form quickly.
It helps that games had these prior mediums to see what the possibilities would be. Like, I'm almost, like you mentioned, even, I'm almost certain that they're drawing influence from theater and from novels and films to do things like this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It does help that they do have a lot of existing thought and development in terms of how narrative works to work on. So you're right on that for sure.
I have one more question about Swords. Not Swords. Why do I keep calling Stranger of Sword City? Stranger of Paradise. If you think about how Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are Dead kind of has lasting appeal now because of its relationship to Hamlet. It's a play that people will continue to read and remember, and it exists both on its own merits and because it allows us to better understand the intricacies of the original text. Do you think Stranger of Paradise has that kind of lifespan, or do you think it'll just be like a drop in the bucket and then we're back to Final Fantasy 1 is great?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? For me, the video game industry is pretty transitory in terms of the longevity that video games have these days. And there's just so many that get released that, yeah, I can't see Stranger of Paradise being that game that we're talking about in 40 years as reverently as we talk about Final Fantasy 1 now. I don't think that's a reflection of the quality of the game. I think it's just the nature of the video game industry being so kind of product driven that things like this one will kind of disappear as an experiment that worked, but an experiment nonetheless that will be replaced by the next game that does something kind of similar. So yeah, that is certainly an interesting point about the video game industry in comparison to some other art forms. I think Elden Ring will be the game this year that ends up getting added to the canon, and that's it.
I mean, it might not, right? Like Sekiro is not in the canon. No one's talking about that anymore.
Yeah, but Sekiro also died very quickly on release. People loved it. People talked about it. We had the discourse about the difficulty levels and all that stuff. It certainly was the center of attention for a short while. But even back then, you could tell that this game was not going to be one that people remembered as reverently as Dark Souls. Elden Ring is more Dark Souls. It is going to be a game that persists on and will be very fondly talked about for a very long time to come. It's more kind of
something big will happen this year. Elden Ring only has one more month tops on it in discourse, and it's an 8 out of 10
No,
max
no.
game. Yes.
Elden Ring is going to persist. I guarantee you that. The only really transgressive, subversive game that I can think of that has that level of longevity to it is the Nier and Nier Automata. Both of those games are ones that have entered the canon and will stay there for being masterpieces and all that stuff. And yeah, I don't see Stranger of Paradise being on that level. But again,
It would
that's
be interesting to talk about what becomes canonical then, because I mean, 20 years in the future, we could see someone go, hey, let's do another take on Neo and do the same thing, right? But
well,
it
we
needs
may
to
well
achieve
do.
that canonical status.
We may well do, and that will be another discussion for another day, but we will do that. I think that is definitely a worthwhile topic to talk about. But for now, we're going to go to some music and then come back, and then we'll talk about something else.